Alright, so this is going to be a quick startup guide for the dynamic interaction component and some of the new stuff that's implemented. So the first thing that's implemented is the support for HISMs. So all these pieces of paper here, they are all HISM. They're all instances of an HISM component, and you can interact with them the same way as you would interact with a normal component. And the next thing is the support for physics. So when I'm holding E, I'm able to pick up the piece of paper and drop it somewhere. And this works the same way for skeletal meshes. And you can see my camera is going like super narrow, like tunnel vision. This is because there is the implementation of post-process effects when we are picking something up and we are letting it go. And we're gonna take a look at that in a little bit. So let's talk about how to get things going inside your blueprint for your character. So first thing you would want to do is go on your event begin play, and of course you will want to add in the ADC DIS component, and then you will want to add this in your begin play, which will be the input mapping context. And this was important to implement because there is really no proper way to allow the player to hold E and then let go and manage physics interaction and static interaction properly. So it was important for enhanced input to be implemented. Next is the implementation of the enhanced input, and you can just copy all of this or copy it from the demo blueprint. Next, we will want to go into the component, and let's talk about the static meshes and the generic ones. So for the static meshes, this is if they are special meshes. So these ones would have a component tag to them, and they would behave differently than the generic ones. So for the generic ones, you don't need to insert any tag in it. Here we don't have any tag. For this one we are putting in a tag, so it's a special type of static mesh. So this is good for like puzzle pieces that are scattered around the environment. So the way I'm using this is like for HISMs, and if there's like a correct piece, I use this setting. So let's talk about how to get a static mesh in the component. So this knife over here, it's not implemented in any way. So we're gonna take a look at how to get that going. So first thing, the way it works is through sockets. So the pivot for this knife here, it's at the handle, and that's not very good when we want to bring it into the player's view or the camera view. So we need to add in a new socket that's going to behave as the new pivot. So I'm gonna type in DIS, and I'm gonna position it exactly where I want the camera to face. So I'm gonna put it right in the center, and the x-axis here, this arrow, this is going to be facing the camera. So if I wanted the camera to be facing like this from the bottom, when we pick it up, I would make it point like this. However, I want a nice and straight view. Next is the setting for the yaw and the pitch. So I'm gonna put in DIS yaw, and it doesn't really matter where you put this, it just works off the rotation values. Next is the pitch. Okay, so the way the pitch and the yaw works, so for the yaw, it works through the z-axis here, and for the pitch, it works through the x-axis here. So it's gonna try to rotate the object around the x-axis, or push against the x-axis. So this is the pitch, so it's gonna try to push against the x-axis. So we want that to be facing to the side. So when we move the mouse up like this, it's gonna push against this axis. It's gonna try to rotate against this axis. And for the yaw, it's gonna rotate around the Z axis. So it doesn't really matter where you put these. You can move them out of the view if you don't want to. And facing up is good enough. You don't need to bother with like putting it in a different position if the item is not in a different position. So now that's done, we can now implement some look at events. So I'm gonna just put an event here called wow. So when the player looks at the edge of the knife, it's gonna fire an event. And it's always gonna take into account the x-axis. So if the camera is facing the x-axis like this, it's gonna fire the event. It's not gonna fire the event if it's like this or like this. It's always gonna try to use the x-axis. So I'm gonna make it face this way. So when the player faces the tip of the blade, it's gonna fire the event that we're gonna implement. So let's go to the settings here. We're gonna go into the static meshes and not the generic ones. And let's take a look at the settings here. First is the pivot offset. So for the pivot offset, so if you don't like the pivot that you implemented here, and this static mesh is supposed to be a special one, you can offset it in here. And here we can just add in the static mesh and then set the camera distance. 45 is usually good enough. And the interp curve. Interp curve is just a linear curve that's going from like 0 to 1, or you can mess around with it. Let's take a look at it. It's just going from 0 to 0.3 apparently. So this is a very no, it's going to 1. So this is going to be a nice interpolation. It's not gonna be like very fast or very slow. And the in speed and the out speed. So when we place the item back, we would use the speed. So it's generally good to put it at a high speed. And for the in speed, you would slow it down a little bit. And for the component tag, so because we are using the static meshes settings, we need to put in a tag in the settings here and inside the level where the component exists. So I'm gonna call it ritual knife. Okay, and for the lookout events, so we implemented a socket called wow, and we need to implement an event here. So the event is the way it works is a global event system. So I already have an event here, and I'm gonna put it in here. So when we look at it, it's gonna fire the curious marks and it's gonna play a sound. Next is the begin play and the end play events. So this is good for the post process of the camera or just anything you can think of. And the way it works is globally, so there is no setup needed. It can exist in any blueprint and it will fire it. So I'm gonna steal some events from one of my arrays. So in here, I'm telling the camera component to use darken and vignette and some blur. And then we will want to turn them off after we are done. So I'm gonna put the blur at something higher, and the darken, put it to off. And the vignette also will turn that off. And the complex trace, so this is good for the blur effect, because when we look at the tip, we don't want to use the primitive collisions, we want to use the complex collisions. and the fourth, physics simulation. So if this object is in the environment and it's a static object and it's not simulating physics and the player is holding E on it and lets it go, do we want to simulate physics when we drop it? So we will take that to true for now. And with that, it's pretty much done. So a quick word on these settings here. This is dynamic camera system settings. We will need to implement a blueprint in here called dynamic post process, and it's in the blueprints folder. So we want to drag that into the level so it can actually implement some of the process effects. And we did not add in the tag for the knife, so we need to do that now. Okay. So you can see when we pick it up, it's going to the socket that we implemented and not the handle, not the pivot of the object. And now I'm gonna move the mouse left and right. So we are rotating around the Z-axis, around the yaw socket. And I'm pushing the mouse up and down. And now we are rotating around the X-axis of the pitch socket. So we played that event when we looked at that area, and it's not gonna repeat it. It's not a repeatable event. So let's take a look at that one more time. So let's pick it up. And let's collect it. And now let's talk about how to implement physics interaction for skeletal meshes. So this pigeon here, let's take a look at its skeletal. So the way it works is by grabbing the pelvis of the skeletal mesh, and that allows us to move it around in the environment. So the pelvis bone is called master. So in my player blueprint and in the static mesh settings, I have the root bone to control set to master. So we are grabbing it from the master bone and we are moving it around like that. Alright, that's pretty much it. Let's take a look at the HISMs before we end this. And it is, except for this one, this is just a normal component. Let's take a look at this paper. So this piece of paper is using the same thing. There are events around all these marks in the corners. And it will not fire if we are facing the wrong direction. Alright, that's pretty much it. I hope this will be of use to you in your project, and if you have any suggestions or questions, you can email me. Thanks for watching.